Hey yo, what is up, gamers? And today I have finally finished every single book in the Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones universe. The world of Westeros. So I want to review these, last 3 books here for you guys, and let you know which ones are must-reads and which ones you can just skip over. Now, I do want to preface that all 3 of these books that I'm about to talk about, you do have to have read the main Song of Ice and Fire series in order to read. If these are your introduction into the Game of Thrones verse, you're not going to have a good time. I don't think so. I think you need to have actually read the main series books, and then you can read these ones. Now, before I get into the books here, I do want to mention I also read all of the novellas that George Martin published as well. And I would say most of them you should just skip. If you're going to read any of them, read the Dunk and Egg stories. They've been released as like a little collection of all the Dunk and Egg stories. And that follows Duncan the Tall and Aegon the Fifth when they were very young. And they go on, some cool adventures that I think is worth a read. But the other 3 that he wrote, I think called Sons of the Dragon, the Greens and the Blacks, all those stories, you do not need to read because they are included in Fire and Blood, which I'm going to talk about later. They're included in full in that book, and they're actually even more detailed than they were when they were originally published. So all of those short stories, I would say just don't read them because you're just going to kind of be spoiled for a lot of the chapters in Fire and Blood. They're also pretty expensive to read as well because you have to buy an entire kind of collection of a bunch of short stories just to read the one short story. So yeah, I would just say just avoid those. So the first book we're talking about here, guys, is The World of Ice and Fire. And yeah, as you can see, this is a massive tome, hardcover. And yeah, there is only a hardcover version. On Amazon, they list a paperback version, but if you click that version, it links to a completely different book. So don't get scammed, guys. There's only a hardcover version. And it is really nice. There's kind of 3D effects on the dragon there. It is definitely a really cool kind of collector's item. I really like the cover and just the look of it. Looks like a sort of ancient text. One of the cool things about this book is this is actually an in-universe book. This book itself actually exists inside of the Song of Ice and Fire universe. It's meant to be written by one of the maesters at the Citadel, Maester Yondell or something. And the fact that it's actually an in-universe book makes it a lot different from the main series, whereas in the main series, the reader is almost like a god-like figure. You know every single character's thoughts, and you can see from this all-knowing perspective. Here, it's not like that. A lot of the information in here, it may be inaccurate. Maybe the maesters don't know everything. There's a few things in here like, that the giants are extinct, which we know from the main series. That's not actually true. The giants have came back. And, yeah, it's kind of written like a real-world history book. And the fact that we aren't seeing things from an all-knowing, god-like perspective makes things more open for interpretation. We don't know everything about the history of Westeros. It leaves it open for people to make their own theories. And it makes it so that the world of Westeros kind of reflects our own world, where, we don't know for certain everything that happened in history. We kind of have to theorize based on historians. Did planes actually hit the towers? Were the planes CGI? We don't 100% know these things. It's up to us to, make our best hypothesis based on the available information. The book is written kind of like an encyclopedia, where it's more of like a reference tool, a companion to the main series, rather than, a book that you're supposed to read all the way through. I did read it all the way through because I'm a degenerate Game of Thrones fan, but you don't have to. In the main series, they, reference a lot of things from the Westeros history. You might be reading the main series and they mention something like, Aegon the Conqueror and his conquest to take over Westeros. And you're like, that sounds interesting. I want more information on that. You can get this book, turn to the page on Aegon the Conqueror, and it has all the information there. So yeah, I think it's more of a companion piece. I wouldn't really recommend reading it all the way through, to be honest, because it is a bit of a slog towards the end. I think the best parts of the book were kind of the ancient history, and then the parts about the Targaryen kings. They go through all the Targaryen kings and their history. But then towards the end, they go over the history of like every single location, like the history of the Riverlands, the history of the Vale, and I just was really bored for a lot of it. But yeah, you don't have to read it all the way through. Another thing I really like about the book, probably my favorite aspect, is the artwork. It has some amazing artwork. This is the Iron Throne. I'm probably not doing it justice with this shot right here, but there is a lot of amazing artwork. And it sort of gives you a frame of reference of like what a lot of these castles look like. They have every single castle, like the Vale and the castle at Winterfell. And it kind of gives you an idea of what all these places look like, so you can imagine them in your head when reading the main series. We have the show, but this is more, accurate to the way that's described in the books here. So yeah, I really liked this book. I think it's really cool as like a collector's item. But I'd only really recommend it if you're a huge Song of Ice and Fire fan. A more casual fan is probably not going to be interested in this. But yeah, I think it's cool. Also, interesting fact, it's written by Elio M. Garcia Jr. and Linda Antonsen, in addition to George R.R. Martin. And these people actually were sort of the creators of a fan website, kind of like a wiki page of Song of Ice and Fire. So I thought that was kind of interesting that he actually got sort of the fans to help him keep track of this world, because there's so much George has to remember. So that's my thoughts on the world of Ice and Fire. Now moving on to my favorite book of the three here, Fire and Blood. Here's the cover right there. And yeah, this is similar to World of Ice and Fire in that it is a, actual in-universe book. I think this is written by Archmaester Gildane or something. And this book is actually referenced in World of Ice and Fire. They actually include the first chapter of this book in World of Ice and Fire in full. And I thought that was kind of cool how the books reference one another. It makes it feel more like, this is a real history book. But yeah, this one, whereas, World of Ice and Fire is more of a encyclopedia, just meant to be referenced on occasion. This is written more like an actual history novel that you're meant to read all the way through. And yeah, I really liked it. I would say this is a must-read for Song of Ice and Fire fans, with a few caveats that I will get into. And part of this book was actually adapted for the House of the Dragon TV series, which I really liked as well. But this book covers a lot more than the TV series will, because this starts from the Aegon the Conqueror, who was the first Targaryen king, all the way to halfway through Aegon the Third's reign. But the show only picks up like halfway through the book when Viserys is the king. George Martin, he kind of borrows from real history books when writing this. The author has to get his information from a lot of different sources of, questionable accuracy. A lot of sources contradict each other. A lot of them sound kind of outlandish, and it's up to the reader to kind of figure out which stories are likely true and which aren't. One of my favorite characters in here is Mushroom, who is a kind of court jester / fool during the Dance of the Dragons, which was this huge war. And he's this kind of midget character with a, 9-inch penis, according to him. And anytime Mushroom tells his version of events, it is always the most explicit, vulgar, degenerate version of events. It's just everyone is having orgies. Everyone is cheating on each other. Everyone is fucking secretly murdering people. Everyone is having sex with Mushroom weirdly. And I like the fact that we, as the reader, don't know 100% everything that happened. It makes it, again, interesting because people can come up with their own theories. And it also makes it so that we don't really know what's going to happen in the show. For any given event, there's like 3 or 4 different versions of what happened, depending on who you want to believe. I hope we get an adaptation where Mushroom's testimony is taken seriously and we just get the most outlandish version of the events. But yeah, I really like this one. Now, there are a few negatives that I think may turn readers off from this. Number one is it's just very different from the main series. It's written more like a history book, and that kind of style may not appeal to all the fans. I think a good litmus test to judge whether or not you'll like this is whether or not you would read a real life history book. If you like reading real life history, that's something that interests you, I think you'll like this book. If that's something that would bore you to death, you would never read a history book, then you should probably avoid this. Also, the story at points can feel kind of disconnected. There was a lot of stuff from World of Ice and Fire that kind of had to be cut down for length. George apparently wrote a bunch of different kind of short stories for this book that had to be cut, and a lot of that stuff made it into here. And I think that does kind of show in this book. There are a few points where it doesn't really feel like one continuous story. It feels like they just took a bunch of short stories and then put them in chronological order to give the illusion like it's one story. But yeah, there's a lot of times where one chapter will not really be connected to the next. There also is a lot of amazing artwork in this book too. It's in black and white. But yeah, really cool stuff. I also wanted to mention, I forgot to mention this, but a lot of the reviews I was reading of World of Ice and Fire and Fire and Blood frequently criticized it for being like biased against magic because it's written by one of the maesters of the Citadel. I could not disagree with that more. They do mention like different religious beliefs and sort of different rumors people believe about the magic. It's not just completely void of magic. Obviously, the maesters may not personally believe that the magic is real, but I mean, they do mention it. Kind of like how a real historian would write history. They leave, more religious stuff out of it, and they only talk about the things that we can verify are true. But, if you want the magic stuff, it's still there. They do mention it. So yeah, I thought that was kind of a silly criticism that I keep seeing of the books. And now we get to the last book, The Rise of the Dragon. Oh, I fucking just swiped my nose hard. Oh. And now we get to our last book, The Rise of the Dragon, the newest book. You may have seen it in stores. And this one just really did not need to exist. The book is basically a Spark Notes summary of Fire and Blood, but done in the encyclopedia style of this book. And yeah, I just don't really know why this needed to be made. This is the only book where it's not an actual in-universe book. This is just like a kind of a summary type book, I guess you would call it. And yeah, I don't really get it. He's kind of recycled over the history of the Targaryens like 3 times at this point, because this book already goes over the whole history of the Targaryens. Then Fire and Blood goes over the first half of it, and then this retreads the same half again. There's really no reason to read this over Fire and Blood. It's just written in like a way more boring style, and less detail. And this book is also not as clear about the sources of the information and where the information is coming from. One example of this is in this book, they reference that there's, a rumor that Maegor killed a cat when he was a young child, and that's likely just a falsehood made up by Maegor's enemies. But then in this book, they reference that and just present it as if it's true, that he murdered a cat when he was a child. So yeah, they don't really give the full context of a lot of this stuff in this book that Fire and Blood does give you. The book is also a lot less detailed than you would think. It looks like a pretty thick book. It's about the same thickness as World of Ice and Fire, but it's actually a lot less detailed. If you look at the pages in World of Ice and Fire, I mean, the page is filled with text, and pretty small text as well. They fill the whole page with 2 whole columns of text. Then you compare that with Rise of the Dragon, and there's like a lot of empty space here. The text is also way bigger. Pictures often take up a lot of the space on the page as well. And yeah, it's just a lot less information. I even looked up the audiobook lengths of both of the books. And World of Ice and Fire is like 21 hours long. This is like 8 hours long. So this is almost a little over a third of the length of World of Ice and Fire. So if you're going to choose one of these like collector's edition type books, I would definitely recommend this over Rise of the Dragon. For one, because it covers a lot more stuff. I mean, they go from all the way from the ancient history to the modern day. This just covers like half of the Targaryen dynasty. And it just has a lot more information. Yeah, so Rise of the Dragon, really did not like. Really the only thing that made it worth a purchase in my mind was the artwork. The artwork is, again, very amazing. Some beautiful stuff. And yeah, so those are my thoughts pretty much. World of Ice and Fire, Fire and Blood, I would recommend. Fire and Blood most of all. Rise of the Dragon, really not a big fan. It was pretty cringe and kind of gay, I'm going to be real. So yeah, let me know what you guys want me to review next. I'm planning on reading the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings series because I got those for Christmas. And yeah, those are obviously very similar to Song of Ice and Fire. But yeah, let me know other book recommendations. They don't have to be fantasy related either, because I'm trying to read just read a lot more. And yeah, peace.